Okay, everyone. So here's my copy of Josephus. It's from 1851, actually. Here is the death of Antiochus of Commagene down here. Over here, about the same time, 30 AD, we have the fake paragraph on Jesus. It's sort of an interruption to the chronicle because we talk about a tumult, Pilate attacking the Jews, they're protesting, and then he continues here, there was another tumult, so that was inserted. On the following page, suddenly, the Samaritan prophet, he starts going onto the Samaritan prophet, so it's all about the same time. So this is the time of Christ, essentially, and there you go. Well, what do you think of that? Well, anyway, everyone, thank you so much for watching this series. It is about time to wrap it up. In the previous video, we explained what I suppose could be the history behind the legend of Jesus. That is, Jesus in actual history, because let's face it, what we have been reading in the Gospels is embellished works written by people, collected stories together, designed to show Jesus in as good a light as possible in order to win converts. That is the purpose of the Gospels. That is their number one purpose. Or the stories are collected. They might not belong to Jesus. They might belong to other people. For example, 3 of the Gospels were unwilling to include the story of the woman being stoned. Let him who is free of sin cast the first stone. Only James included that one. And you have to ask... John, included that one. You have to ask, why is that? And the answer is quite simply because the other ones thought that it didn't even belong to Jesus. I think it's as simple as that. But the other one included that because he thought, well, that's a nice story. That's a good story, but it could be hundreds or thousands possibly thousands of years old. Now, we haven't really explained why the story that I've shown you, the Samaritan story, is different to the legend about Jesus that the Romans and we learned. In this video, we explain details behind why the legend changed, exactly why. Why did this guy, a prophet from Samaria, who was killed by Pilate in 36 AD in history, an innocent man, why is he different to Christ of the Gospels? Well, the answer is easy. The legend was fluid until it was written down at the end of the century when other prophets existed, performed commendable deeds, so commendable they were written into the legend as if Jesus did them. Now, in the last video, we suggested that the historical Jesus is the Samaritan prophet who caused tumults in about 36-37 AD. He was unfairly executed by a greedy Pontius Pilate, who was perhaps after the Ark of the Covenant, or at least artifacts of Moses, according to Josephus. I'm guessing that being in possession of these would have made him king of the Jews. Pilate realized this, and that's why he decided to act with such violence and fury. Now, the Samaritans had their own resting place and temple for these artifacts, independent of the temple in Jerusalem, which was the place favored by the Babylonian Jews. I'm guessing Judea had a much higher population in the day. It's so interesting, isn't it? When we look at Josephus and we see that some later monk was unable to find Jesus under the correct timeline in the entries, and he inserted his own fake description of Christ, but coming from the mature Christian tradition, yet as if Josephus had written it in the 1st century, which makes no sense. And he, as you saw earlier, he inserted it right nearby what he should have been looking at, Josephus' possible record of actual Jesus, Pilate, etc., as the Samaritan prophet, the earliest story of Christ, in my opinion. I mean, isn't it just too much of a coincidence? But the legend didn't stop changing until it was written down in the Gospels, and we have to find out how it changed. So it was still fluid after the death of the Samaritan prophet, and we then have 2 further prophets who scrambled the tradition. The thing is that these 2 are mentioned in the Gospel tradition independent of Jesus. Independent of Jesus. And therefore they are not Jesus. But here's the thing. The Samaritan prophet is never, ever mentioned in the New Testament, or I believe any of the apocryphal New Testament books, as the Samaritan prophet or at all. And that makes no sense because this was a major thing. Therefore, these books, the New Testament, etc., they are treating him as if he was Jesus. That is the proof. That is the evidence right there. Now, Later authors had very little to go on. How could a Roman or Greek comprehend the political and religious context and point of views of an obscure Canaanite people? I mean, who the heck knows what the differences are between the Samaritans or the Edomites or the Judeans or the other Canaanites or the Byblos people? I mean, how heck the Bible isn't either named after Babylon or Byblos, and we don't even know why. We don't even know why. We don't know the political context, what was happening, the religious context, the fights between them, the infighting. Do you know why? All these people were massacred. The Edomites were massacred at the end of the 1st century by the Romans. The Judeans were massacred over and over by the Romans, massacred each other. The Samaritans were massacred, and then they rose up against the Byzantines. They were totally destroyed by the Byzantines. Over and over and over again, all their history was wiped out. I can't believe we actually have Josephus, so we can see what was happening in the 1st century, and it lets us distinguish things. So, how did the Romans supply information about the life of Jesus? Now, we think the first gospel was the Q source, the parables. I think most of those are possibly from the Samaritan prophet. He was obviously a very big talker, according to Josephus, so he could have said lots of these things. But the rest of the adventure was, I think, supplied by either consulting Josephus and related texts and oral traditions about the other prophets who lived soon after. There was simply no other choice. The result is what we have today. Jesus was a historical character, but the Gospels are mythology. Understanding this concept is just pivotal to isolating what really happened, because then you can isolate components one by one. So, the Gospels were written long after the Jewish wars, and they are so pro-Roman in the light of historical detail we've just been reading regarding Pontius Pilate that you can see quite clearly they were used as political propaganda, possibly to exonerate the Romans. And they were written for Roman worshippers of Christ, for Roman consumption, so that Romans would not be offended. Roman worshippers of Christ would not think, oh damn, what wicked people we are. So, very soon after the Samaritan prophet, and this is what confuses everything, we have another guy pop up, and he's written as Theudas. That name is suspicious. Someone's put it into Greek, it seems, but was then unable to translate it back into what it would have been. Judas, Jesus, Thomas, who knows? Theudas seems to be the guy who the Bible describes as John the Baptist returned, as if he was Jesus, because he seems to have performed water baptisms. Just like the Samaritan prophet 7 years earlier, this man seems to have claimed to be the new Moses, because he actually claimed he was going to part the river, and then, just as in the case of the Samaritan prophet 7 years earlier, Roman cavalry arrived and killed them all. Except it wasn't under Pontius Pilate, it was under a guy called Theudas. So this guy, Theudas, he was a Jewish prophet, and he was copying the Samaritan prophet. And they only lived 7 years apart. They both had lots of followers. So can you see how someone in Rome couldn't be able to tell the difference between them? Now, this happened around 45 AD, and the story is very, very similar to the Samaritan prophet's story. So they would have been confused, their deeds conflated and confused. Now let's read over what Josephus wrote about this in the Jewish history. He wrote, "It came to pass while Theudas was procurator of Judea, that a certain charlatan, whose name was Theudas, persuaded a great part of the people to take their effects with them and follow him to the Jordan River." Doesn't that sound like Jesus telling people to drop everything and come with him? And he told them he was a prophet, and he would, by his own command, divide the river. Now, isn't this a little bit walk on water? And afford them an easy passage over it. This is the walk on water stuff. It's entered the Bible. Now, it says many were deluded by his words. However, Theudas did not permit them to take any advantage of his wild attempt, but sent a troop of horsemen out against them. After falling upon them unexpectedly, they slew many of them, and took many of them alive. They also took Theudas alive, cut off his head, and carried it to Jerusalem. So there you go. Now, soon after, in the 50s AD, we have another imitator. Another guy trying to become king by popular revolt, except he was in Jerusalem. And, of course, part of the Jesus story is set in Jerusalem, isn't it? Now, this guy said, I think he's the one who said, I'm a good shepherd. And he was possibly even wearing Tutankhamun's regalia or some Egyptian regalia, because he was from the south. He may have had a shepherd's crook. He may have also been trying to be a new Moses straight out of Egypt, and he called himself the Egyptian. And even the Talmud, the Jewish Talmud, records a tradition that says that Jesus was someone who learned black magic in Egypt. So there is clearly some confusion here. And this guy in history was called the Egyptian. We don't know his name, that's been blanked out, and is mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles as a Roman soldier actually asks St. Paul if he is the Egyptian. So, therefore the Egyptian is probably not Jesus, but bits of his story might have entered the New Testament. So, you can read about the Egyptian in Josephus also. He was probably spouting Hermetic doctrines from Egypt, of which the New Testament is packed. He lived in the 50s AD in Judea and made a lot of trouble there. Today it's known as, I think, applied Christianity, some of his doctrines, and it's a form of self-help, motivational talk, partly refounded by the likes of Norman Vincent Peale. You can do anything if you only believe you can, that kind of stuff. And I think that's the Egyptian component. We conveniently do not have the actual name of the Egyptian, but wouldn't it be a shock if he was called Jesus as well? I do wonder why their names, except for maybe Theudas, have been written out of history. Was it all too inconvenient? Now, Christ simply means God has chosen him and is a title associated with whoever should be a king. Crest is similar, and it means good one, and the term was also used for early Christians. So were they called good ones, possibly good Samaritans, or were they called Christians, which means the kingly ones? Who knows? Every single Eastern king was a god king, so they were all a kind of Christ. And in other words, every single revolutionary leader in this deeply unstable time of Syria, Palestine, Judea in the 1st and 2nd centuries would have been Christ, as they were all supposedly chosen by God. Do you see how confusing this is possibly getting? The Egyptian tried to start a revolution which failed, but had tens of thousands of followers. I think this is the Palm Sunday material which has entered the Bible. He actually apparently led 30,000 followers up to the gates of Jerusalem, and then he said the walls would fall down, but they didn't. Now, he was not executed, he simply managed to vanish without a trace. They didn't let him into the city. What about his followers? Did they all just vanish into thin air, as history currently supposes? Or did they start a religion somewhere? Did they combine with the followers of the other prophets? Was there infighting? Was there fighting about who the actual Christ was when they combined their efforts? I mean, what's going on? Or did they start a religion somewhere? Did they have to flee to Rome? Did they start making trouble in Rome? Were they the Christian troublemakers? If you read Josephus, you'll see that parts from the Bible about Jesus in Jerusalem sound a lot like the life of the Egyptian in the 50s AD. Now, soon after all this, we have the Jewish wars, and about the same time, Jerusalem itself is invaded several times with various coups. We now encounter the problem of the Jesus family tomb, popularized in a book of that name, of the 2000s by Simcha Jacobovici and Charles Pellegrino. They describe an artifact known for quite a long time, a box which contained the remains of a certain Jesus, son of Joseph. Mary is his wife. There are more names from the Bible there. And so far I've distinguished history, Josephus, from myth, the Gospels. But now look at this. I mean, we have possibly archaeological record in the form of this box, which is unprecedented. And so far the evidence seems to be that this box is the genuine article. That's what it seems to be. So how do we explain this? What's going on here? It dates to the right time. I think this relates to the temple priests in Jerusalem, the aristocrats. This is the Jesus as an aristocrat component, descended from David and Solomon. There is, after all, a legend of Jesus teaching in the temple as a child. How could this be possible unless he was not a member of the elite of the priesthood already? That's the only way, surely. I think the Jesus entering Jerusalem story is actually either about the Egyptian or the the Edomite invaders from the south. So what happened was, during the Jewish wars, there was actually a coup. And just before the Jewish wars, there was a coup against the temple priests. These temple priests all went by the name of Jesus, or two of them did. And the Iscariots started executing people. And the Edomites from the south helped. So, hence you have a guy who is supposedly suddenly deposed by the mob. So possibly even more Palm Sunday material. A guy who was worshipped in Jerusalem. Then a week later, there's a coup. So there is a series of Jesuses who lived about the same time, just before and during the fall of the city of Jerusalem to Rome, just after the Titus revolt, and during and just before. Let us remember that as soon as the gospel was written, perhaps between the 60s and 100s, that's it. It can't change anymore. It has to stay the same. That's the end of the development of the tradition. You write it down, you destroy any further development, and then that gospel gets spread around. So all the possible Jesuses had to live probably just before this time. So the time scale is of the AD 60s is also, you will note, way off for the historical Jesus, but their actions could have still contributed to gospel tradition of Jesus. Jesus was a common name. You see, Jesus did this or Jesus did that on some apocryphal document. It doesn't fit the New Testament, and you wonder what's going on. So early people, I guess, would have added it to the tradition. It's as simple as that. So here's how it works. There is a passage in Josephus which refers to the execution of James, brother of Jesus. Let's read it below. And it's talking about, it seems, one of these priests. So you will see there is a statement, as we will read, Jesus, who was called Christ, quote unquote. That's probably also a marginal addition by a monk, but we don't know for sure. But this younger Ananus, who, as we have told you already, took the high priesthood, that's in Jerusalem. He was a bold man in his temper and very insolent. He was also of the sect of the Sadducees, who are very rigid in judging offenders, above all the rest of the Jews, as we have already observed. When, therefore, Ananus was of this disposition, he thought he had now a proper opportunity. Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. But as those who seemed the most equitable of the citizens, and such as were the most uneasy at the breach of the laws, they disliked what was done. They also sent to the king, desiring him to send to Ananus that he should act so no more, for that what he had already done was not to be justified. Nay, some of them went also to meet Albinus, as he was upon his journey from Alexandria, and informed him that it was not lawful for Ananus to assemble a Sanhedrin without his consent. Whereupon Albinus, that is the Roman governor, complied with what they said, and wrote in anger to Ananus and threatened that he would bring him to punishment for what he had done. On which King Agrippa took the high priesthood from him, when he had ruled but 3 months, and made Jesus, the son of Damnius, high priest. So essentially here you have, this is the story of the Jews taking action, of executing James, a Jesus-like figure, possibly related to Jesus, according to this, who was called Christ, but he probably wasn't, because the time scale is wrong. We're talking the 50s, the 60s, doesn't fit at all, but someone's decided to add that because it sounds like the Bible legend. Well, it sounds like the Bible legend because the Bible legend is drawing on this same story, I guess. But it's, as you can see, the time scale is wrong. It just doesn't fit the Pontius Pilate story at all, which is something else. Someone wanted to place Jesus in Josephus, so he added Jesus, who was called Christ. So, and then we see that this person, Ananus, was replaced by the Romans, replaced by Agrippa. with Jesus, son of Damnius, high priest. So we see Jesus as a high priest. We draw attention to the margin addition. If you take out that margin addition, Jesus, son of Damnius, and Jesus who was called Christ, if you get rid of that second one, the fun begins. Of course, whether or not the pro-Christian comments are marginal additions or not is still controversial. In my 1851 New York edition, the editor and translator William Whitson actually amazingly writes that Josephus must have transformed, this is what he writes, into a Catholic Christian, quote unquote, during his life, thus explaining why he seems to have changed his own text. Now, I don't think so. I think it's clear the changes were made by people who were trying to place Christ in history later on. That's what happens to manuscripts, as we discussed. So once you excise that awkward who was called Christ, suddenly you're talking about the previous mentioned Jesus, the other guy, and the passage becomes about the only other Jesus mentioned, Jesus, son of Damnius, making it seem that after persecution, Jesus enters in triumph and becomes high priest. And we all know about Palm Sunday. Now bear in mind, and so of course there would have been processions for this. That's what's in the Bible. Now bear in mind this was a very unstable time, a time of crisis, for Palestine was at war with Rome. Of course the people were desperate and seeking a new identity to save them, and people like Judas Iscariot were running riot, murdering anyone who dared go against zealot political ideas. And this entire faction was deposed by zealots, just as Christ of the Gospels was deposed by a zealot, Judas Iscariot. The fact is, if you look at Jesus of legend, he is a politician. His words carry conviction. He knows how to talk. It's the same with High Priest Ananus, Ben Ananus of 68 AD. It is said that he was an effective speaker whose words carried weight with the people. Guess what? Throwing money changers out of the temple? Well, that's obviously temple politics. For example, Ananus actually threw the zealots out of the temple. They were allegedly robbing the people and using the temple as a base of their operations, and he chucked them out. So there's the story of throwing the money changers out of the temple, possibly. So it's really the most obvious place to look for Jesus among the high priests and priesthood of the temple. Look for a guy who has fallen out of favour. So Jesus of Damnius ruled the temple for less than a year. He did not last. You see, it's not just Damnius, but the stories of 2 or 3 of them from this period all combining, and also combining with the earlier stories of the Egyptian, Theudas, the Samaritan. There is a lot of temple politics in the New Testament. It was financial as well, as religious centre. So at this time we have 2 basic factions. I'm not really sure how to categorize them. I don't think anyone is. No one is from that time. We have what I would call the moderates under Ananus, who stones James the Just, and we have the zealots, supported somehow by the Edomite invaders from the south, also known as the Idumeans, in opposition to Rome. Now the zealots let the Edomites into Jerusalem. They then killed the priests. And that quote in the Bible about the temple falling, well, that starts to make sense, probably because it's now in the hands of the wrong faction, and the people are saying, that temple, that's going to fall now. You see, Judea was being invaded, attacked from the south by the forces of Edom. They had their own religious Jewish interpretations, which I guess would have been closer to ancient Egypt. That's an old Egyptian colony. And many of Jesus' doctrines are indeed Egyptian sounding, aren't they? Hermetic. We might imagine this was all a renewal of the invasion force, whatever the hell it was, led by the Egyptian prophet of the 50s AD. I mean, why else would a city worship Jesus and suddenly turn on him and demand his death? The events of it's politics, but the politics has been written out. The events of the New Testament are too condensed. Obviously, there was a kind of coup brought on by an invasion. The priest to follow was Jesus ben Gamaliel in about 64 AD, who instituted an education system for young children. He therefore seems Jesus-like to me as well, because recall how Jesus treated children as adults and said, you have to become childlike in mind if you want to get to the truth or into the kingdom of heaven. And he resists the Edomite invasion from the south, also a coup by the zealots, people like Iscariot. And guess what? He was executed for his troubles, seen by the fanatics as a traitor. So this Jesus was killed by the Jews. In 70 AD, everything changed again. Finally, Jerusalem came under the siege of the legions, who attacked the city, imprisoning and executing zealot leaders. I mean, do you see how Jesus fits into this period? He's being questioned by people to see where his loyalties are. Jesus of the Gospels, he's asked about the image of Caesar on the coin, and he wisely says, "Oh, give to Caesar what is Caesar." So he's actually possibly that was a zealot trying to test him, possibly, and the story's changed. So he's actually shown as being pro-Roman. So more and even more Jesus-like figures would have been killed during this time. There are no more high priests after this time. That was the end of a lot of them. And with presumably thousands and thousands and thousands of crucifixions done by the Romans. So in 1,000 years, someone will claim that due to all the similarities, World War I and World War II were actually the same war. It's the same thing going on here. A series of praiseworthy priests had their deeds associated with what would become the New Testament, written by people in foreign lands who couldn't possibly tell the events apart or even begin to comprehend, as we cannot, the politics of what it was all these people were fighting about and fighting for. So after the Jewish wars, everything becomes utterly even more confused, but the confused still wanted to be enlightened, so the Gospels were written by those wishing to embellish the story of what they had heard, preserving it for posterity, even if it drew possibly on the traditions of a number of different people. Because, hey, it's for a good cause, right? This is the end of this series into the historical Christ. I hope you have enjoyed it. This is my personal opinion on the Jesus story and the history behind it. It might be wrong, who knows? I think the Samaritan prophet of history must be Jesus. He lived at the same time and is strangely not mentioned at all by the New Testament. I think meaning he is one and the same person, but the story was modified and contaminated due to other prophets who might have copied his example very soon after, and thus supplying more information. We will move on to other topics in the next few videos. Thank you all for watching, and good day to you.